Hello, my name is Lawrence Haddad. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN, and I'm really delighted to be doing this interview. And the first question I was given was, tell us a bit about how being born in Africa and growing up in the UK affected your view on nutrition and your career in general. It's a difficult question to answer. I'm actually of Lebanese descent. All four of my grandparents are Lebanese. That's where the name Haddad is from. I was born in Johannesburg in South Africa, and then my parents moved to the UK when I was about 18 months old. So being born outside of the UK and being from a culture, a Lebanese culture, and having grandparents and lots of family in Lebanon, and yet growing up in the UK kind of brings home to me, I think, even as a young child, the sort of fairly randomness of where you're born and how that affects your life, and the fact that every person should have an equal shot at becoming who they want to be and making the contribution they want to make to their families, their communities, and beyond. So I think that gave me a sense of how random life can be, and how it shouldn't matter where you're born or where you're grown up to be able to fulfill human potential. Growing up in the UK, we grew up in a fairly modest background. My mother was brought us up on welfare, which is we were given state support for. I was given free school meals. We had free housing, all sorts of free services, and I think that reinforced the power of the state, how the state could do good things for people to help them escape from poor circumstances. My mother also was a volunteer in civil society in Save the Children, and I got to meet lots of people who worked in Save the Children or worked for the Save the Children charity shops, and I got talking to them about the roles that NGOs and civil society can play. So that was a big influence on me. And my uncle was a marketing rep for a flavouring company, a small flavouring company in the middle of England. And he used to tell me, this is back in the 1970s, he used to tell me stories about what the food industry was doing and the kinds of technological advances that were very popular in the 1970s. And so that gave me a sense of the power harnessed in the appropriate way that the private sector could play. So I think even from a very young age, I had a good sense that different parts of society had different roles and brought different skills and attributes to bear on the problem. Question two was, when I was a young man, I was very motivated and driven by experiences I had in the Philippines and India. This was in the mid 1980s, of seeing kids that were literally skin and bone and being fired up by that and determined to do something about that. And that was from experiences in the Philippines and in India. And the question that I had from my friend was, has anything really changed in India? And I think it really has changed an awful lot in the last 30 or 40 years. When I look at India today as an outsider, I see a country with a plan to do something about malnutrition, a national plan which is built on lots of formidable and powerful and inspirational state-level plans. I see leadership that is committed to doing something about malnutrition. I see resources being allocated. I see legislation being passed. I see frontline workers being employed. So I see, most importantly, I see numbers coming down. Stunting numbers have come down from about 47, 48% in NFHS 3, I think, to about 38% stunting levels in NFHS 4, and I fully expect the next NFHS to show even more striking reduction in stunting numbers. And I think what's the continual driver for me in India is the fact that India has such an ambitious vision of itself, modern India, and I think high levels of stunting are just not compatible with that very modern vision of what India wants to become and wants to be. So I think that is also a very powerful driver of change. Now, I am an economist, and my one of the questions was, how do you see the intersection of agricultural production, poverty reduction, and nutrition? And I've spent a lot of my time sort of at that interface, trying to figure out why is there so much malnutrition where agricultural production and productivity seems to be at its highest? Why doesn't income generation improve malnutrition? And also, how important is malnutrition reduction and prevention for income growth and for agricultural productivity? And I think it's fair to say that the links between productivity and malnutrition are fairly weak, and one of the reasons for that is that lots of ag productivity is geared towards crops that are either non-food crops or food crops that are sold outside of the immediate area that they are grown in. The price is too high for people who are really desperate and destitute to be able to afford that food. Why doesn't income increase nutrition status as much as we think it would? There is obviously a relationship, but it's a fairly loose relationship. And again, there are lots of reasons for this. An increased income doesn't necessarily, it may allow you to buy better foods, maybe, but it doesn't necessarily allow you to get access to better sanitation or better water. It doesn't necessarily give parents more time to spend with their children or even more knowledge about how to provide for their children's nutrition. So improved income is of course helpful, but it's not necessary, and certainly it's not sufficient to improve nutrition. I spent a lot of my time trying to convince ministers of finance and ministers of policy and ministers of planning that improving nutrition status has a big economic return, and the evidence is very clear it does, even in the short run for adults, especially those involved in physical labor, but perhaps most importantly in the longer and medium run for infants who are prevented from being malnourished, who then go on to learn more in school, do better in school, do better in the labor force, earn more money for themselves and their families, help their families get out of poverty, prevent future generations falling into poverty, and help the overall economy very substantially. Another question relates to the role of human rights. Why is, human rights, it's easy to say that it's a bit like, the Americans say motherhood and apple pie. How can you be against human rights? And when you view human rights as a very sort of abstract concept, it's easy to say, yes, it's a great thing, but it's also easy to dismiss it as not being relevant. And so I always try to think about human rights in a way that is, yes, of course it is a fundamental right. It's one of our civil, political, economic, social, and political rights, but cultural rights. But how do we think about it in a practical sense? And for me, at least for nutrition, I can think of three very immediate practical returns. One, we often talk about people being able to claim their rights, but children can't do that. Children have to rely on other people to claim their rights, and I think having a human rights perspective is especially important to safeguard the rights and the voice of children. I think the second thing that a human rights perspective does is it really throws light on the duty bearer's responsibility, and very often duty bearers they don't feel like they have a responsibility, and of course they do, but sometimes they feel like they have a responsibility, but they don't have the capacity or the resources to actually fulfill that duty. And I think the human rights perspective for me is a great way of reminding ourselves that even though a duty bearer has responsibility, sometimes they don't have the capacity. And I think a really good example of this is the imperative to fill frontline vacancies for Anganwadi workers and frontline nutrition workers. With vacancy rates of 50%, you're never going to be able to fulfill the state's obligation to reduce malnutrition and prevent malnutrition. But with vacancy rates of 10 and 15%, you stand a chance. And the example from Maharashtra, I think, bears this out, where they halve stunting rates within a 10 to 12 year period. And I think finally, the rights perspective is very important because it holds the government to account. It holds the executive and the legislature to account. And in India, the Supreme Court has been very important in pushing through a whole range of food, nutrition, water and sanitation related policies and obligations, and forcing the executive and the legislature to act when perhaps they found it inconvenient or difficult to act.